Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies.
Thank you for tuning into the NAACP Forum. There's no doubt we are Brockton's choice for civil rights news. Today I have Detective or retired Detective Ken Williams in the studio. Detective Williams, thank you for coming in today.
Thank you, brother.
Listen, Detective Williams has had a storied career in the Brockton Police Department, but even after the Brockton Police Department, he's had a unique career across the country as a certified by the federal court as an investigator. I'm going to have him talk a little bit about use of force, but Detective Williams, tell us a little bit about your career in the Brockton Police.
Sure. I mean, I became a Brockton police officer back in 1995. I was hired under the COPS grants back then.
What, sir?
COPS grants.
Oh, okay.
It was 1994, the crime bill was passed. President Clinton at the time signed the crime bill into law after Congress passed it. And that was a way for the country to hire 100,000 new police officers.
Right.
And I was one of the first hired in the city of Brockton in 1995 under the COPS grants.
Wow.
And from 1995, through the end of my career, I believe I did some great things for the city of Brockton and some of the residents.
Listen, so you're hired in 1995 under the COPS bill. And as a matter of fact, I'm glad that you mentioned that. We'll talk a little bit about the war on crime. But then there came a time you was promoted to detective. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was around 1998, 1997, 1998, I became a detective in the city of Brockton, plainclothes detective, generalist detective at first, and then later on specialized in homicides and things of that nature.
Would you say that for an officer of color, was that a pretty quick promotion from the rank of patrolman or patrol officer to detective? Was there something unique about your situation?
I mean, I think as a patrolman, I had a unique experience investigating some major crimes involving guns. Throughout my career, I've managed more than 70 gun cases, and I've been shot at twice in the line of duty. I've had to use, escalate to the use of deadly force myself in my career. So there were unique situations, I believe, that at that time made me a fit for becoming a detective. But you're absolutely correct. It was rather unique for a minority officer, to become promoted, especially with the way my career began in 1995, where discrimination in the city of Brockton, unfortunately, was very clear at the outset.
So you're saying, when you say clear, what does that mean to our audience, clear?
I mean, when we think about history, recent history, and I'm not talking about, that far back, when we think about the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Yes, sir.
And we think about where the country was before 1964, which led us to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a monumental law that was to promote equality and equal access. I'm a benefactor of that law. But in the city of Brockton in 1995, when I was hired, two black men could not partner with each other in the city of Brockton based on the policy at the time.
I'm sorry, so you said policy.
As
The actual policy.
The actual policy.
And why was that?
The former chief at the time, when I tried to partner with a fellow officer who was a black officer after completing the academy, we were told in no uncertain terms that the city of Brockton was not ready for two black men to be responding to calls together.
I'm sorry. They were not ready for two black police officers to be able to, they didn't want two black police officers responding to calls. And that was the actual policy of the police department in 1995.
Our request was denied, and that's what we were told for the reason.
With 1995, there's almost
1996.
1996 is almost the current generation. This is going on within the time of our children.
That's correct.
I would have been, I'm not going to tell you how old I would have been. That almost slipped out. But so how long were you with the Brockton Police Department?
I retired in 2010.
2010. Why did you retire?
I was forced out for assisting a black citizen who was wrongfully arrested.
Is that the famous Samito case?
It's one of them.
Just one of them.
There's many other cases before that, but it's the famous Samito case because that's the one that became public. That everyone seems to reference back to. But unfortunately, there are many other Samito cases or similar Samito cases that happened before that that aren't public.
When you came on to the Brockton Police Department in 1995, how many black police officers were on the force or police officers of color?
There were none, well, there was one of rank, that would have been Lieutenant Shanks. He was the only person of color, and I believe he retired maybe a couple years after 1995, if I'm not mistaken. But other than that, the force may have had less than 20 minority officers at the time.
Out of how many?
Maybe 140, somewhere.
Wow.
150.
So you joined the Brockton Police. Are you from a family of police officers?
No, I'm from a family of civil rights activists who actually were whistleblowers themselves. They fought against apartheid in South Africa, boycotted Fortune 500 companies, and were able to successfully, through domestic and international campaigns, actually afford people who weren't in America freedom, that didn't exist prior to their intervening. They were working for a company. My parents worked for a company called Polaroid.
Oh, yes.
And Polaroid was supporting apartheid through its ID system, instant camera, instant film system, which supported pass books, which every black person in South Africa was mandated to carry. And if you did not have your passbook on you, your ID on you, you could be subject to not only arrest, but death.
My goodness, my goodness.
So that's what my parents experienced back in the 60s into the 70s.
But you joined the Brockton, clearly you joined the Brockton Police Department to become a police officer. You didn't join to become a whistleblower. So there had to come a time that something happened that you said enough was enough. Can you, and just to let the audience know, Detective Williams, Investigator Williams, has a pending lawsuit against the city of Brockton. He can't talk about that. So we're going to try to pull stuff out of him the best as we can. With that said, there came a time that something must have happened. What happened that triggered your resolve to fight for other people in the police department?
Well, I mean, I think my resolve was way before becoming a police officer. You know, I mean, I think my resolve was as a black citizen of the United States. Growing up, I clearly understood and experienced what inequality is, what discrimination is. So being a part of the city of Brockton and the police department, it was unfortunately, as I stated, very early on in my career, discriminatory decisions by leadership, policymakers, to have a policy where two black people can't ride together when white men, white women could ride together. That clearly is discriminatory.
Right.
However, you know, being young police officers, the officers that were there at the time, especially the young ones who had just got hired, you don't want to rock the boat. You want to see.
It's your career.
You want to see where this can go, and
Right,
hopefully
right.
things will improve. And unfortunately, in policing, because you have a lot of authority in policing, I joined the ranks and file of men and women who I understood very clearly from the history that as a black citizen, being able to protect and serve the community, the entire community equally, it's very important. So it requires people who look like me to go out and be able to have diversity and inclusion, to have a voice for the voiceless, have a voice for the people who are, the poor, impoverished, the folks that normally may not receive adequate service because of the color of their skin. And I wanted to go and be able to bring them the best.
Right.
You know, maybe because prior to my arrival, they didn't receive that.
Right.
You
Right.
know, and I wanted to become a member of a force that would be able to do that. And I can tell you, I mean, throughout a career of being shot at and having to use deadly force, it was discrimination that ended my career. And I want to make sure that that statement is quite clear. You know, at the end of the day, discrimination is what ended my career.
So you come on to the Brockton Police Department. Did you receive any onboarding from a person of color like a Lieutenant Shanks? Who onboarded you to the policies, the culture of the Brockton Police Department? Fellow white officers?
Well, no, you're an eyewitness to it. When you're inside the system, you're inside that system. I mean, the general public may, hear reports from outside the system, but that doesn't necessarily mean those reports are accurate. When you're inside the system and you're witnessing what you're seeing, you're hearing, you're smelling, you're there, it's a little different. If you, as a police officer, understand what those policies, you have to read your policies. You know what they are. And at the same time, what's written sometimes is written, and then what's actually carried out is an unwritten policy.
So there were realities that were inconsistent with their policies.
Yeah. I mean, if you
Can you give us some examples? Can you, again, you're saying 1995 to 2010. That was not too long ago.
Well, I mean, let's bring it more current, okay?
Oh, yeah.
Let's say Officer Frank Baez. If you report to work and you have someone that has blatantly lied, that you on a videotape have struck them. Another officer is saying that you have struck them. There's a videotape that exonerates you. The officer that claims that you struck them and the other officers that are responsible for investigating that fall back on the word of the white officer, but the minority officer who has a videotape and is told, there's a videotape that exists, but you can't get it. Or it takes you a year to get the videotape, but in the meantime, you're disciplined.
Oh.
How is that fair? And then at some point in time, Officer Frank Baez has to file a lawsuit to protect his due process rights, protect his job. And ultimately the city settles that case. That's recent. That's just recent.
Right.
So that is...
So nothing's changed. So Detective, you're saying nothing's changed, right? I mean, that's what you're saying.
Policies are written, and conduct that is carried out that may even violate policies is a culture issue.
Right.
So you may have faces that change, but culture is very difficult to change if it's deeply embedded inside a system.
You've done, and we're going to get to the work that you're doing currently, but how do you change the culture? I mean, clearly you're beyond being articulate. You're like a professor in this. So how do you change the culture if the bias case is so fresh in our memory? How does the culture change? Is Chief Crawley doing his job? Is Mayor Carpenter doing what he needs? How do we change this culture?
Well, I mean, in any corporation, it stinks from the top down. And when I
is it okay if I say ouch? But go ahead.
But if it stinks from the top down,
right.
You have to go and look at the fact that policies aren't driven from the bottom up.
Okay.
They're driven from the top down.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So if you have it where, let's say, for instance, the bias case, who's been held accountable? I'm asking you. Who's been held accountable? Do you know?
No.
So if you can't answer who's been held accountable, it stinks from the top down, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, currently, so what they explained to me, the rankings, everybody's promoted by the civil service rank. Are you a proponent of the chief of police position, just getting rid of that, and the mayor being able to hire a civilian to come in and manage the Brockton Police Department, having like the Boston, like a commissioner come in? I mean, is one of the problems that we're promoting the culture from bottom up, and it always remains? I don't know.
No, I'm a proponent of the Department of Justice coming in under a consent decree and holding everyone accountable and looking at every policy and finding the defects in those policies, and at the same time, for officers who commit egregious acts of excessive force, contempt of cop, due process issues where they violate the due process and civil rights of citizens, hold them accountable. If you hold them accountable, guess what? You'll change the culture pretty quickly. But if you have a culture where a police officer, Frank Byers is a veteran police officer.
I know he is. I know he is. Yeah.
And if you can't have a veteran minority police officer hold someone else who has committed fraud, signed an affidavit, there had to be someone that signed an affidavit that reported that there was an incident that took place. And if the court has said, hey, you know what? That incident isn't as accurate as that person signed off on. If you can't answer who's been held accountable, then the issue obviously is from the chief and the mayor's office down.
So you ended up filing a federal lawsuit that we're not going to really talk about the details, but there is some details you probably can talk about. Tell us a little bit about why the Justice Department intervened with a statement of interest. That's a bit unusual.
Well, it's not unusual.
Okay.
I mean, if the Department of Justice, it's looking at a motion for reconsideration as I'm standing in the shoes of the United States government.
Right.
Even though I filed a lawsuit,
Right.
I'm filing it on behalf of the United States. So every citizen, I'm filing that lawsuit on your behalf. The United States government is the corporation that's being
Right.
the victim of fraud, waste, and abuse. So standing in the shoes of the United States government, it's imperative for the United States government at times to look at what is happening with the case that has been filed on its behalf. So it intervening and writing a statement of interest, flying in from Washington, D.C., testifying and in front of a judge.
But Ken, you're being a little bit too modest. They actually feel that your case is credible from what I read. I mean, so it's
definitely credible. It's not a frivolous law.
Right. So people have kind of portrayed that, I think, in the department. Like, you're just
Someone probably portrayed Officer Frank Byers' lawsuit as being frivolous as well.
So
everything about what the rumor mill does.
Right, exactly. So there's Justice Department interest in your case. Now, could you just tell the consumers or the audience, because I really don't know, what is the False Claims Act?
The False Claims Act originates back in the Civil War, and what the Civil War, what happened was there were merchants that were doing business with the federal government. Maybe it was, they were selling firearms to Union soldiers that turned out not to have firing pins. They were defective, right? Ammunition that may have not been to spec as far as the federal government was concerned. So those merchants committed fraud, waste, and abuse to the federal government, and the federal government sued them and went after them civilly to recoup costs. The False Claim Act in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s was a little revamped by Congress, where they started looking at medical providers for services. It could be used against universities. It could be used against people who fraudulently claim that they were building affordable housing, and then turned out, like in Westchester County, New York, which is a very rich neighborhood,
very rich community.
Rich community.
Yes.
They said they were building these affordable housing units. Turned out they were $500,000 or so a piece, and the government came in and said, wait a minute, through a whistleblower, that's fraud. We need to recover our funds because that's not affordable. So the False Claim Act has been a vehicle that the federal government, the United States, recovers billions of dollars each year to offset this fraud, waste, and abuse that's committed by private and public actors.
How's that applying to Brockton?
Well, I mean, the case is about fraud, waste, and abuse from the city of Brockton, which intentionally and knowingly did so, and that the taxpayers should be able to recoup their losses from that fraud, waste, and abuse.
They're telling me we're almost at that 10-minute, but I have a lot to talk to you about. So you are an expert certified by the United States Federal Courts as an investigator. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you do in terms of your expertise and use of force?
Well, not an investigator. I'm certified under the Daubert standard through federal courts based on...
What is the Daubert standard?
The Daubert standard is a court case. Daubert is a court case where the justices were able to make a determination on who should be recognized as an expert based on either scientific level or technical expertise and specialized skill that a jury and a judge may not have a particular understanding about a certain skill, certain type of job. So an expert can come in and explain what it is exactly that occurs in that particular profession. So in my particular case, I'm an expert in police practices, use of force, wrongful death, and on the state side, I'm an expert in handwriting, as a handwriting expert as well.
Really?
For the state of Massachusetts.
Wow. So clearly you're an expert, but you've been involved, testified in some pretty celebrated cases across the country. First of all, and thank you for your service. Can you give us an example of or a case that you were involved with so the audience will know? Because I want the audience to understand that often enough we hear people that, unqualified African Americans getting roles, complaining about discrimination. You're not an outlier. You are the real deal in terms of everything that you know. Tell us about one of your celebrated cases.
A recent case, City of Sacramento hired me out in California to review a case involving two officers who had shot and killed a black citizen that was armed with a knife. And the case, and one of the officers' names are John Tennis and Officer Lazoya. And the case involved the two officers being fired from their jobs, from their actions administratively. And the district attorney's office did not find any fault with the officers criminally, but the city of Sacramento found fault with the officers administratively.
Okay.
And the police chief, Chief Hahn, out in Sacramento, felt that it was necessary to bring an expert in, so they called me up, hired me to review this case because administratively there was a civil service hearing that I testified at based on my review of all of the case material, which was probably 10,000 records or so, video and things that aren't public record. I was able to make a determination that in the case of Officer Lazoya, that he should not be able to get his job back, and I testified to that based on my findings. Unbiased opinion.
Unbiased opinion. So your career, kind of like the way you ended with Brockton. So your career now is really assisting municipalities or other folks that need you, and to look at corrupt police practices and excessive force. Pitch you against your fellow law enforcement professionals.
Well, there are times that I don't side with the people who have me review a case. Sometimes I have to tell them bad news. I don't see anything here. What the decisions that were made, they were proper, and we part ways and stuff. But there are those moments that when I do see that the officer did not use reasonable judgment, reasonable force, force was excessive, violated the policies and practices, the training of the officer, that as a reasonable police officer standing in the shoes of that officer, I can put pen to paper and say why it is that that was unreasonable.
So in the city of New York, there were several African American police officers that were going through some similar issues with the New York Police Department. They ended up in a very celebrated lawsuit. But let me just ask you, one of the things in their documentary, they explained how their colleagues were treating them and death threats. Did you experience threats to your life from former colleagues? Do you receive that now that you're doing this type of work? I mean, tell us about your safety.
I do my best not to go down that road, only because it's too much of a distraction. My position now is to try to encourage other police officers, good cops, who are within this bubble, to try to have them find their strength to come forward with the information that they have. Because one of the things that I found rather interesting is that, whenever you think about critical mass, before you have critical mass, you have individuals. And individuals who may not find, strength in numbers, they have to be able to withstand the blowback, the retaliation that they are going to experience.
Yes, right.
So once you get to the point of critical mass, and I think, we're starting to find a tipping point in America where There are a lot of minority officers, a lot of white officers, a lot of women officers, police officers, who are starting to say, you know, wait a minute, enough's enough. I can't stand back and allow what I see as being an injustice, a civil rights violation, an illegal practice to continue. And they're one by one starting to come forward. And I would never want to go and thwart that by talking about what happens to me personally.
Right, right. You just don't put it out there.
I got shot at in the line of duty a couple of times. I had to shoot somebody.
Right.
You know, so I'll deal with that as it comes along.
Do you see, and I know you said it's top down, but do you see any sort of improvement? I get there was a recent class of additional minority police officers looking at doing something with 911 emergency operators. Do you see an improvement in the police department, or is that just artificial for right now?
Well, it's only my opinion, but let's put my opinion aside and just speak from a factual point of view. If you and I don't speak English and we go to the police department to file a complaint against a police officer, is the form that we're going to receive, if we receive the form to file a complaint, is the form going to be in English? Am I going to have to go and fill this out in English? Is it in my native tongue?
Right.
If you can't answer that question,
Right, I get it, yeah.
then that's the same process that's been in place since 1995 when I first got hired.
Do you think...
let me take it a step further.
Yep.
If I do make it to internal affairs, is there someone there that looks like me, that can comfort me in my native tongue, that is a supervisor or subordinate of a supervisor to assist me? If your answer is that you don't know and you can't answer that right now,
Right.
then I can tell you that not much has changed since 1995. Let's take it one step further. Are there supervisors that might be able to respond to assist me, that look like me, that speak my native tongue? If you tell me that, hey, you know what, there might be one,
Right.
there might be two.
No, there's one, but go ahead, yep. Oh, no, two, right, yeah, right.
Since 1995, there's only one or two.
Right.
Then I can tell
And
you.
I know them, actually know them.
There's
right.
not much that has changed since
right.
1995.
Wow.
So let's speak from facts
Right.
rather than opinions.
What will they tell the audience? So what would the consent decree do?
Well, the consent decree is to protect the United States and its interests
And
in what it has formed and given in terms of a contract with assurances to make sure that the city complies with that. So it's up to the federal government to decide on what that should be.
you hear a lot in private corporations that have experienced issues of diversity. The first thing that they do, they bring in a vice president of cultural competencies or diversities. Brockton Police decides somehow to bring in a black chief of police. Does that change things on the ground?
Well, before we get into the hypotheticals, why did the city of Brockton hire a current police chief that was under investigation for the stolen theft of thousands of dollars with other subordinate officers? How did that person become the most qualified applicant?
Gotcha.
Out of the field of possibilities. So instead of talking about the hypothetical, why don't we stick with the facts?
The facts. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Brockton Police retired Ken Williams, an expert in the use of excessive force. Brother has been shot at. He's served the city of Brockton very well and has been treated very badly. I need to go on the record and say that. But so I'm going to, we're cut for time now, but I got to ask, is there a political future for Ken Williams in the city of Brockton?
I have discussed that with my wife. You know, sometimes in order to be in a position of change, you have to place yourself in the position of leadership.
Amen.
And it is something that has crossed my mind, but in the immediate moment, it's not there.
You heard it from Ken Williams. We are the NAACP Forum. We are Brockton's only choice for civil rights news. Thank you. Thank you, Detective.
Lift every voice and sing till